Hello, everybody. My name is Rajni Hatti. I'm going to stand over here for a minute. I'm very excited to be here today, part of Women Techmakers Montreal this year. I work for a company based in Boston, Massachusetts called MaxMind, and we have employees all over the US and Canada. We create tools for online fraud detection and IP intelligence. And I have been in the software industry now for about 20 years. I started out my career as a software developer the first couple years, and I really gained a passion for software testing, and I started on that path, and I have done that ever since. So today I'm going to be talking to you about REST API testing. And how many here have done any sort of API testing before? Okay. Great. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to just spend a couple slides just talking about the overall strategy that I found has worked really well for me in the past and kind of how to approach API testing. And then we'll actually run a real-life automated API test. Okay, so the first question that I get a lot is, what exactly is API testing? How is it different from the testing that most of us are more familiar with, which is user interface testing? So the biggest difference between API testing and UI testing to start with is that an API it's just an interface. It's a way to communicate with a server and a database using HTTP communication. So the biggest difference is that it's really not as visual and as intuitive as testing a browser or an application, something that was designed for human interaction. An API is something that is really just a method of communication with a server and a database. So a lot of times what happens in the software testing world is that this type of testing, because it's not as well understood, it's sometimes not done as thoroughly as it could be. And in other cases, it's even just kind of forgotten about until very late in the process when the API is almost ready to be released. And this type of testing really should be done early on in the process. So I found through the years that there's some tools that have really helped me in making this process and this type of testing more visual and more intuitive. And so in our example that we go through later on, I'm going to show you some of those tools. So I just want to take a quick, make sure everyone has a quick understanding of what HTTP communication actually is, because that is important for us to know when we run our automated test. So we're going to start at the top arrow. So we use our API as a framework to make an HTTP request. And that request is going to contain at a minimum 3 things. It's going to contain a method. A method is just, are you reading or are you writing information? Are you deleting? So we need to specify that. We need to specify a path. So we need to say where on the server that we're actually going to get this information. And then we need to specify an authorization if there is one, if there is a license key or a username or password. We're going to have to specify that in the request as well. And then following down to the bottom arrow, so our server gets this HTTP request, and then we get an HTTP response back. That is typically made up of, at a minimum, 3 things: a header, which is going to have usually the format of the information coming back, among some other things; a status, so were there errors in the response or did it come back okay? And then a body, which is going to be the actual data that you're requesting. That's typically an XML or JSON format. And our example today, we're going to look at JSON. And so my yellow dotted line shows what is considered API integration testing. So it's that back and forth communication between our server and our database. And then outside this dotted line is a browser and application. You can integrate your API into a browser or into an application, but this testing needs to be done much before that process. So we want to test the API as early as possible to discover bugs early in the software development process. All right. All right, so next I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the strategies that have worked well for me in the past. And so I call these my 4 R's. And these are things that I think it's really important to think about when you're setting out to write automated API tests or even any type of manual testing. A lot of this applies to regular UI testing as well. So what are some of the things that we should think about? So my first R is readable. So as I mentioned, this type of testing is not as visual and as intuitive as UI testing. So we want to figure out a way to make our tests human readable. So I should be able to communicate what my test is doing, what my automated test is doing to someone else, like another tester or a developer. I should be able to do that easily. I also need to find a way to make the results visual. So I want to be able to know if the test passed or failed quickly. And I want to be able to communicate that as well. And then my second R is repeatable. So in testing, we have a best practice that says test early and test often. So we want to test the API at the beginning of the development process. We don't want to wait till it's almost ready to be released. So we want tests that can be repeated throughout the development process. And this is where automated testing is a really great fit, because we can create some set of automated tests that we run throughout the development process that give us that test early and test often feedback. And then the third R is reduce risk. So we can't test every single thing there is to test. We have to think about time and cost, and we have to focus our testing efforts in the right places. So the way I like to think about this is in terms of risk. So I want to make sure I have tests that reduce my risk of failure. So if we already kind of know that there might be certain areas that are just more prone to failure, I want to make sure that I have tests to cover that. And then I also want to look at risk of impact. So even if there's an area that maybe doesn't fail as often, but the impact of it failing would be a very large problem for your customers, then you definitely want to have tests that cover those scenarios as well. And then the last R is range. So I want to think about how comprehensive my tests need to be. So what is the range of tests that I need to create? So regression is a very good area for automated testing. I want to make sure that every time I create something, a change in my API, that I can go back and test all the existing functionality and make sure that nothing got broken. So that's one area that I want to cover. And then testing gaps. So one area I found that is very important is to make sure that as a tester that you're communicating with your developers and you're making sure that if they're writing unit tests for this API, that you are also making sure that you understand what those unit tests are and you're not duplicating that effort as part of your integration tests. So you want to make sure that maybe there are certain things that might be better tested as integration tests. So there should be that back and forth communication between the testers and the developers and deciding how can we write just enough tests not to duplicate effort but still cover all our bases. Okay, so next. So now we talked a little bit about how to approach this, and then next I want to talk a little bit about the tools that I've used that have been really useful for me in the past. So we're going to drill down one more level and say, okay, well, how do I take this and actually turn this idea into an actual automated test? So API testing actually is fairly a simple 4-step process. In the first slide, I talked about HTTP requests and responses. So the very first thing that we want to do is send our HTTP request. And today I'm going to be using a tool called Rest Assured for that. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. The second step is to read the HTTP response. So in our case, in our example today, we'll be getting the response back in JSON. I'm going to want to be able to parse through that data and figure out what I actually need to check out of that data. So we're going to use a tool called a JSON viewer, which allows us to see the data very nicely formatted and figure out how to get out what we need. And then my third step is to evaluate the response. So I want to be able to decide, once I check the data that was returned back, I want to be able to evaluate if it was correct or not. And so for that, I'm using a tool called Hamcrest Matchers. That's a tool that can be used even just not for API testing, really any kind of testing. And that's going to help us compare what we get back with what we expect it to be, and then decide if the test should pass or fail. And then the last step is to present the results. So once I know that the test passed or failed, I need a way to show that very clearly to the person running the test. So it's really what we're going to be doing today in our test is just this 4-step process, and we're going to run through it for however many test cases that we have, and then we look at our results. Okay, so now I'm going to switch over to the fun part, and we are actually going to look at an automated test. So before I start, what happened? Let me try this again. Okay. So we are going to be using the Google Books API. So this is just a free public API that just is going to work very well for a simple test like what I'm going to do. What Google Books API does is it will allow us to create an HTTP request, and we will we can make a search request, and it's going to return all the books that it has in its database that match that certain search request. So we are going to search on ISBN number, which is like a book ID. So the first thing you're going to do when you start writing API tests is you want to look at your developer's documentation. So I'm just going to go over to the documentation here, and I'm going to look on performing a search. And so when I want to perform a search, this is the URI right here where it says HTTPS. That's the HTTP GET request. That's the format of the request that I'm trying to make. So before I even start writing the test, what I like to do is just check my URI in a browser screen and just make sure I have the right format. So right here is what we actually need, and then where it says search plus terms, I'm going to substitute the ISBN. If you just see down a little further, it shows all the different things that we can search by, and so I'm going to search by ISBN. So I'm just going to copy this, and I'm going to check this in a browser to make sure that I'm constructing my HTTP request correctly. So what I'm doing here is I just cut and paste the initial part of it. It's pre-filling an ISBN number that I had already typed in here earlier today, so we're just going to go with that. If you look down here, there's a title, and that's what we're actually going to try to parse out in our test, and we're going to compare what it's returning with what we expect it to be. Okay, so now I'm going to go over to my actual test. So I'm writing this in Java today. This can actually be written in many different languages. Rest assured, it is a Java-specific tool, but there's other tools out there that do something very similar. So the first thing I do, lines 3 through 6, I just import my libraries. And then line 8, I just create a class called Google Books API. And then here's where testng comes in really useful. I have these annotations, so where it says at on line 10, it says at before class. That's going to allow me to, it basically will run this method before my first test, and then it will do any setup that I need just that one time. So instead of me retyping my base URI every single time in every single test, I just set my base URI as part of my setup in my before class, and it just will do that automatically for me. And then on line 15, I have an after class annotation, which essentially allows me to do my teardown after the final test. And so there I'm just using a rest assured method called reset, which allows me to just reset my base URI and any other variables, and that's just kind of a testing best practice. So I went ahead and did that. And then the next part here is our data provider. So our data provider is also through testng. That's just a tool through testng where we can create, instead of writing the same test multiple times, we can write one test and we can just have the data provider feed that test different types of data. So like the data that I have set here, what I want to use is this particular CSV file. I have 5 ISBN numbers and I have 5 titles that I expect it to return. So instead of me writing 5 separate tests for this, I can just write one test. And I just set up my data provider to pull in that file and feed that to my test. So Data provider will always return a two-dimensional object array. So I just have that on line 21. On line 22, I just am creating this two-dimensional object array, and I'm using a separate program that I wrote that's called a file utility, and all that does is take that CSV file and it imports it, it parses through the whole file and puts it into an array, and then it just passes it to this data provider. So just in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through that right now, but if you'd like to see how the file utility works, I can show you that afterwards. And then the next step is my actual test. So on line 27, I use my @test annotation, which is a test ng thing again. And then I have a data provider. I just want to state that I want to use the data provider that I created just above on line 20, and that's called book data. And then on line 28, I just named my test. So I just named it book name test. And then it's going to take two input parameters in this case because I have two columns in my input file. So you need to make sure that however many columns you have in your input file is how many parameters that you want your test to have, input parameters. So I just named mine ISBN and book title. And then here's where the rest assured methods start coming in. So on line 29, I have a .given.param. So this is where I set my parameters for the test. So all I needed to do as part of this was to set that the format was JSON. If I had an authorization, like a license key or something, I would do that as well in the parameters method. And then I have .when.get, and so that actually is going to construct my HTTP request that we talked about. And so this is where the base URI comes in. So the get method works so that it's going to take whatever was in my base URI, which is on line 12, and then it will append this part right here. That's the volumes, and then just putting in that I'm searching by ISBN. And then I'm going to append on the ISBN number that I'm getting from my data provider. So essentially what we've done is programmatically created this same thing that I have in my URL. I mean the URI that we created. I'm programmatically essentially creating that exact same thing. And that's what my automated test will run. So then once that sends that, it will construct the HTTP request, it will send it, we'll get back a response. That's where the then.body comes in. So now rest assured gives us the method to actually parse out the data that we get back and then compare that to, so the body method does two things. It allows us to parse through the data that we got back and then also to check to see if that data was correct. So you might be wondering on line 31 what this snippet of code is, so I want to tell you about that. So here in our JSON data, we need to figure out how to get to the book title. So the easiest way to do this is to use a viewer like this. I'm using Firefox and it actually just formats my data for me. The JSON viewer that I mentioned in one of the slides can be used as well. So what you want to do is you want to say, okay, items is an array. That we know it's an array because of the two brackets that are next to it. And then I drill down a bit further. And so items contains one thing. In the 0th index, it's got an object. And we know it's an object because of these brackets. Within that object, I have a section called volume info. And within that volume info, I have a title. So essentially, that's what I'm doing here. I'm drilling down into the tree to get to the title. So I'm taking the 0th index of items and then .volume info, so I'm drilling down one more, and then going to title, so drilling down one more. So that's extracting my actual response. And then here, book title, I compare it to the response that I'm expecting, which is what was here in my CSV file. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this test. And hopefully the internet will not fail me this time. Okay, so my console just shows me something really simple. It just shows me that I ran 5 tests and 1 failed, and then 4 must have passed. Okay, so testng gives me a really nice way to look at this. it's just another tab that comes up, and it formats this really nicely for me. So this very easily shows me, okay, 4 of the tests passed, they're green, and then the 1 test failed. So I did cheat a little bit on this failed test because I just wanted to show you what a failed test looks like. I purposely just put the wrong book title in my CSV file so it would come back incorrectly. But this will show you very clearly on the right side that what I expected was the Sorcerer's Stone, but the actual was something different. So, and then the one other thing that TestNG gives us is even another set of even more kind of fancy reports. And this you will find over here if you go into the test output folder, if you look on my left side. And this will also show you very clearly what passed. If I want to see what failed, I can go look there. So this really helps being able to communicate with other people of how the test was done and what actually happened, what were the results. So that pretty much covers my test. And if there's any questions, please feel free to ask me. Oh my goodness, what was that? Oh, and I am on LinkedIn too.
They want more like, this is what we want, but then there's best practice. Which one should
I think it's important to understand what the best practices are. I think it's more of a guideline, so every situation is different, and sometimes you'll decide as a team that may not make sense to do certain things. I think it's really important to communicate with the developers about the testing, because sometimes developers will test a certain way, and as a automated tester, we would have a more kind of like a high-level approach, or like we would think more broadly sometimes, and that's a really important perspective to have as part of the development team. So I think best practices are good to have, and it's good to say that, hey, I think that this should be tested because this is really, something that could break something else in the future. But I don't think it should be like a black and white, hard and fast rule, if that helps. Go ahead.
How many types of API testing? Like, based on which conditions?
Yeah, so do you mean like besides integration testing, what are the other types? Yeah. So I'm glad you asked that question because that's a really good point. Integration testing is really just one type of API testing, and it's kind of what I see as kind of the forgotten testing with APIs. Security testing and load testing are very, very important as well. Those require a whole nother set of tools, and those are typically done as well. You would need a different set of tools and different methodologies to do that. And then usually APIs will also have unit tests. So developers will just create small little tests to test certain things. The integration testing is really important because that's where you're testing the communication back and forth with HTTP communication. So those 4 are probably the most. So unit, integration, security, and load testing are probably the 4 most important areas for API testing. Mm-hmm. You're welcome to come up afterwards. I'd be glad to talk to you or find me later.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.